Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Nick Halaris Show. Our guest this week is Yasmina Zaidman, the Chief of Development and Partnerships at Acumen, and no stranger to you all. This is Yasmina's second time on the show. We planned this episode, a few months ago when we recorded the first one, and I'm honored to have her back on the show to discuss a super important topic. So thanks for being here.
It's great to be back, Nick, and it's crazy how much has happened since the last time we did this.
Yeah, I was thinking before I logged on to record this that had we attempted to forecast what the global political environment is going to look like the time we record this, we would have never actually accurately predicted what's happening. So a lot really has changed in a very short period of time, that's for sure.
Yeah, I wish I could say it's changed for the better, but I think that there's been a lot of curveballs and there's a lot of uncertainty and anxiety. But I think having conversations like this and kind of helping people focus on how do we move great ideas forward is really important right now.
Yeah, completely agree. Before we get into the questions, I just wanted to tell you the episode we did with you and kind of covering the highlights of Acumen and the work, it was one of our most popular and one where we got sort of the most amount of feedback from people, both newsletter readers and podcast listeners, because of just the incredible work that you all do. And just wanted to share that with you. And thank
That's
you
so nice
again.
to hear.
Yeah,
Yeah, thank
people
you.
when they find out what you guys are up to, they're like, "Oh my God, this is really interesting," because it's just not something you hear a lot about. This merging of the philanthropic intent with entrepreneurship and business is just so unique, and it's working, and that's what really gets people excited. So
Yeah, well, it's great to hear that. And I feel like right now people are hungry for kind of messages of hope, what is working, what is possible. So it was fun to have a chance to share some of that with you last time.
yeah, absolutely. Well, great. Well, today's topic is kind of more in line with what you've been focused on at Acumen, which is this idea of development and partnerships, both with government and corporations. And where I wanted to start the conversation is, gosh, we just went through an absolutely fundamental, it feels like a fundamental change in the philosophy and the intent at the government level as a result of the DOGE effort here in the United States. To me, as an observer, like DOGE feels like sort of like a half finished project that got abandoned. But in reality, it's like completely changed your world. And I figure there's no better place than to start there. Like, how has that impacted what you do and what are you seeing on the ground?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up because I feel like there's too many people that aren't even really aware of the impact of some of those decisions. I think it was couched in the context of efficiency and reducing fraud and saving money, but the reality of really going after certain agencies like USAID, which is, responsible for our overseas development aid, really has had massive impact on the lives of not only people living overseas, but people who've committed themselves to building a more sustainable and inclusive world in ways that create security and create stability globally, really to benefit Americans in so many ways. So we've looked really closely. Our community of entrepreneurs and local leaders is pretty broad, and we've been able to see kind of where those hits are being felt. A lot of local organizations do get funding either through USAID or through the intermediaries that they had supported. And some of the organizations in our network had to shut down or end initiatives. Hundreds of people lost their jobs. And these are people who just get up in the morning every day to try to make the lives of vulnerable people better, right? That's what was undermined here. And at the same time, as we saw this vulnerability, and it had a really heavy impact in places like Colombia that are rebuilding after a civil war, a part of the world we all really want to see have stability and progress, and also places like Pakistan and Bangladesh, where we're seeing a lot of really significant impacts from both poverty, but also climate change. So you just think about the long-term impact of really kind of undermining efforts to create more sustainability and stability there. And at the same time, for us, because so much of our work is with entrepreneurs and with for-profit entities, we've seen quite a bit of continuity for those kinds of organizations, particularly the ones that have been able to mature past the point where they need any grants, have started to scale, have raised commercial capital, because the way that their model works is they have customers who look for their products, every day. And so in certain sectors, we're seeing that while there's still uncertainty about the global economy, about tariffs, that there was nothing sort of disrupted overnight when USAID was dismantled, because they're continuing to operate their businesses. And that was encouraging, right? It really showed us that in addition to providing grant funding for really vulnerable people and broken markets, that when you can start to build markets that work, that you're creating something that has more resilience, even if political winds shift. So it was very affirming that this has to be an important part of how we think about development moving forward, because the disruptions among those more market-oriented organizations was far less. And they're still serving, again, vulnerable people in these same global South economies, but they're able to just keep that momentum moving forward.
Yeah, it's almost like DOGE, and particularly the USAID stuff, was a huge hit to the ecosystem of organizations attempting to tackle things like climate change and vulnerable populations around the world. But it sort of like proves the business case of Acumen actually in a huge way, which is that, hey, if you actually build capacity in the form of cash flowing businesses, it doesn't matter who wins office. It does matter, but it doesn't matter as much, because you've actually got a self-sustaining situation. So that it's a double
Yeah,
edged.
and the same is true at the local level, right? These are countries where politics shift constantly, and some governments are more friendly to supporting smallholder farmers or encouraging women's participation in the workforce, and others aren't. So, in our view, the best scenario is everyone sort of working together in the same direction and playing their part. But the reality is that if one stakeholder decides to pull out, there are others that can kind of continue to carry the torch. And like you said, it is an ecosystem that needs to work. And so the ripple effects of this loss of support, the loss of trust, the loss of credibility is going to be felt for a very long time. And I think there's a huge opportunity for other stakeholders, the private sector, individual philanthropists, foundations, to get involved, not just to close the gap, which may be impossible, but to think about from this moment, how are we strengthening those local ecosystems so that, again, we don't have to sort of repeat the mistakes of the past, which have often created a lot of dependency. So there's a chance for a refresh, a fresh take. And a lot of those larger government funders, in fact, is sort of ironic, were really interested in supporting market-based solutions. They were moving in that direction and really proactively engaging the private sector. So to sort of just terminate the whole thing doesn't really make any sense. I think the US government would have had a lot more influence if they just continued and really reshifted their focus on how do we build, more sustainable solutions in the long term.
Yeah, like had someone sat down and thought about it, about how to reallocate the money, like they're probably, they could have come to a different conclusion. I want to talk about the gap in a second, but I want to close the loop just on the sort of the impact. Like, remember the State of the Union when President Trump basically came up, and this is when he and Elon were still good friends, and he was celebrating the work of DOGE, and he listed off like some crazy, to what sounded like crazy contracts, like to countries that, most Americans don't even know they exist. And I think he even said that at one point. He's like, nobody knows where that is. And it was like a $6 million contract. Is that just like completely glossing over the details of those contracts? You might not know the exact details, but just curious your reaction to that moment in history.
Yeah, I mean, it was a sort of a ludicrous moment because they were identifying examples that would do the most possible damage in terms of people's understanding of what this particular agency did. And the sad thing is that, I don't think people who do work in international development have done a good enough job to educate Americans about why we do this and what it means for our country to be showing up to mitigate the spread of diseases, which again benefits all of us as we've dealt with a global pandemic, to detect diseases, to help to stabilize communities, to, especially in Colombia, where we've been really active, to really help rebuild an economy on principles of democracy and peace. It's a trading partner. It's a country where we've seen a lot of migration over the years. And it was one of the places in the world that USAID provided the most funding. And you can really see the impact where they've helped to enable that local ecosystem to rebuild after, civil war and conflict. So those were the stories that weren't told, right? That, we're staving off the spread of diseases. We're helping, if nothing else, to build a really strong brand for the United States as a country that is compassionate and that has its influence in the world, not only through, our brands like McDonald's or Coca-Cola, but also being known for compassion, being known for showing up when communities are in dire need, and for building these cooperative relationships with countries that matter to us for different reasons. So they didn't tell that story, but frankly, neither did the rest of the development community. I think people sort of took for granted that it was just so much a part of our ethos that it would always be there. And so it was quite easy, I think, to spread misinformation at that moment that this was fraudulent, that it was frivolous, that it really addressed these sort of random isolated issues rather than the fundamentals that it was really built to address.
Yeah, it was a missed opportunity for the country and for the world. And I think a lot of Americans don't understand that the history of this. Like this goes back to the American mindset in the aftermath of World War II and the understanding that, like, man, we're not going to take over the whole world. We're not going to put troops in every place. We physically can't do it, and so we need to be a benevolent, leader. And that intention is something I still believe in. I feel like to turn away from that is to turn away from the good work of people who literally had the chance to establish like world dominion and chose not to, and said, you know what, instead of nuking everybody, we're the only ones with nuke. Instead of doing that, we're going to actually rebuild the world. We're going to set up international aid organizations. We're going to help lift people up. And we're just like, forgot that history, and we're just focused on kind of hyperbole, and it's sad to see it.
Yeah, but I also, again, I think there has been a missed opportunity before this moment. We have to be aware of our history. And I think, there were a lot of efforts after World War II, not just to think about how to strengthen democracy and stability and peace around the world, but also to establish markets. So there's a lot of development work that's been done, not just by the United States, but by many governments that really focus on strengthening domestic markets. So rules about what gets supplied and who is earning money from making those supplies. I mean, it's an industry. And so, again, I think there's things worth really scrutinizing, right? Does it make sense to bring everything in from outside of a country if your goal is to create a more prosperous, self-sufficient economy? Does it make sense to support countries in a way that limits their own development of solutions? So what I think is really exciting right now in this moment of reflection and refresh is thinking about the potential for really robust economies in the global south to work together to solve some of these problems. And you're hearing this from leaders really across the board, but I've seen this in sub-Saharan Africa and India, saying we need to be accountable for solving these problems on our own. We can't afford to be dependent on outside governments who may change their priorities. And so I had a chance to visit Kenya a few months ago and visited one of our portfolio companies called Soko Fresh. And it's a great example of where, we're seeing innovation move from India to East Africa. They have solar chilling mechanism to basically build a cold chain for food from farmers. And you can see they've got, products from India being used to refrigerate products from farmers in Kenya that are then being exported to consumers in Europe and to boost incomes for farmers. So the world is going to move on. It's going to find these opportunities. And I think it's just a question for folks in the US to say, what's the role that we want to play, right? In terms of our identity, our ethos, things that matter to us. We're a country of immigrants. And I just think it would be a big missed opportunity, but I don't think we have to kind of try to go back. I think we can move forward and think about more collaborative partnerships that are designed to be more, sustainable.
Yeah, and in these examples of international governments kind of stepping up, are you seeing them step up and embrace the ethos of Acumen, or are they stepping up and trying to fill kind of the older models, or is it a little mix of both?
I think it'll be a mix of both. And I think people are still figuring out, what is going to work. I think governments will have to think about, what they want to prioritize and may have to prioritize different things in terms of whether it's more industrial development or whether it's more kind of humanitarian. A lot of these folks are navigating big challenges. And when you think about issues like displacement, right? People who are migrating because of climate change. These are problems that were not caused in the countries that are dealing with it, but they're facing it. And so they'll be at a crossroads, right? Do they want to develop as quickly as possible so that they can manage some of the economic burdens, even if that's bad from a climate perspective in the short term? If they're going to think longer term, right, and really think about how to build an infrastructure that is more designed for mitigating climate change, they might need outside investment and support to do something that has kind of global benefit. But one thing we can't do is ask these countries to forego development, to forego their own path towards progress for the sake of the global climate crisis. They are facing it, they're dealing with it, and I do think there's a global responsibility. Whether or not the US chooses to participate from a government perspective, there's so many ways and so many resources that leaders and institutions in the United States can say, we will continue to be a part of this effort to deal with this global challenge. So it's also just recognizing that, there's a lot that we can learn from other parts of the world that are saying, we need to face these responsibilities. I think the idea of pulling back and withdrawing, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But if our federal government has chosen that path, it's like we can vote on that, I guess, in the next election. But as individuals, as investors, as leaders, we have opportunities every day to demonstrate that we still feel like we're part of an interconnected community.
Yeah. And it's such a tricky discussion to have with people, unfortunately, in this country, because even people who are super climate conscious in their intentionality, the idea around the development is where people get caught up. Because on the one hand, you might say, like, let's not let Bangladesh advance their economy so that they have higher GDP per capita, because the way in which they're going to do it is going to be really detrimental to the climate. But they need, if we're not going to help them with resources, if the international community isn't, they need to generate them on their own. And maybe that's going to be really negative to the climate in order to do that. But it's rational for them, it's rational for Bangladesh to do that. But it's just a hard argument for people to kind of get their heads around, especially if they really believe in doing something about climate change.
Yeah, and but I mean, it can seem harder and more complicated conceptually, but I think in terms of people's day-to-day life, I think the idea of being interconnected isn't actually that hard for people to understand.
Yeah.
I think that particularly in Southern California right now, I think people are really feeling the fact that they're in a part of the country, a part of the world that is part of a global conversation, right? Whether it's immigration, whether it's politics, whether it's, the awful fires, it's sort of inescapable that things that happen outside of your community will affect your own community. And so I think it sort of follows that it goes both ways. That things outside of our community can affect us and the things that we do will affect others. And I think there's a natural yearning that people have to respond to that feeling. I mean, I think a lot of people are really overwhelmed, and sometimes you kind of need to figure out, like, what am I going to focus on? Because you can't, save the whole world all at once. But I feel like, in the places that I spend time, whether it's in the US or, in Africa or in Europe, I think people are really waking up to how interconnected we really are. And I think technology supports that. So then the question is, what do we do with that? And how do we embed that in the way that our institutions operate? Because it can't just be an individual feeling, it has to actually inform the ways that we work. So again, I think what the US administration is doing is a little bit of an outlier, but it's given cover to a lot of other folks to say, okay, it's okay to operate out of short-term self-interest. No one's really going to notice if we do because there's others doing it much more visibly. I think a lot of people are questioning that approach.
Yeah. Are you seeing, I haven't really followed it, the response of like the European governments or China, for example. Have they pulled back significantly on the aid front, or have they just kept on going with their strategies?
It really varies. And there's a lot of factors, again, these sort of ripple effects. We're seeing some governments that are leaning in, sort of really doubling down and emphasizing that they want to continue on that path of supporting aid and again, thinking about it through this lens of how are we addressing shared challenges or issues around climate change or displacement? And then others are pulling back, and not necessarily because of a lack of, concern, but, redirecting funds towards a national security in Europe, which is a very pragmatic need, and again tied to US policy. So those ripple effects are very real and very much felt in the government space. Again, there will be governments that do something quite different, and I think they're the ones to watch because there's a real opportunity for leadership. But I think we're going to see a whole new set of players kind of moving in to address some of those gaps. And again, not just to fill a hole, because the amount of funding that's being pulled away is so massive, but to start to reimagine, how do we build a more interconnected globe? What is the role of the private sector? What is the role of individual philanthropists? The accumulation of wealth that's happened over the last few decades is incredible. And there's this huge intergenerational transfer of wealth that's happening that will concentrate wealth in the hands of women and young people who may make decisions differently and may be open to rethinking kind of what is the value of this wealth and how can it be directed towards things that people really care about.
Yeah, which is it's nice to have like a hopeful perspective, and it feels
It's pretty critical right now.
I know we need to. Well, what are you seeing? Like, you guys are on the front lines of innovation in this fight against poverty and climate change. What are you seeing that makes you excited as far as the financial innovation or new players coming in, philanthropists, corporations? Let's talk.
Yeah. Well, a couple examples. One in the US that I think is incredibly hopeful. We have been working closely with Reckitt, which is a brand that's known more so in Europe than in the US, but actually has a lot of products on the shelves here. And they have a real commitment to supporting health and access to health. And so they've partnered with our team here in the US, Acumen America, to support diverse entrepreneurs that are helping to make healthcare more accessible. It's a really significant partnership that will bring needed capital to early stage entrepreneurs, many of them women, who, as you probably know, get less than 2% of venture capital funding, to really help unlock the potential for innovation and leadership and new solutions for vulnerable Americans around healthcare. So it's really exciting to see a significant commitment. It's called Reckitt Catalyst, and their aim is to support 200 entrepreneurs around the world that are focusing on innovations in health. And to be a part of that here in the US, Serena Williams is their entrepreneur in residence. She herself is an entrepreneur and an investor in social enterprises. And so to really bring these different brands together, if you will, to advocate loudly for the need for entrepreneurs to get that support just gives me a lot of hope. And it's just a critical moment in the US, again, when we see policies that might undermine access to healthcare for vulnerable people, to see a global brand, a global icon, to see Acumen all stepping up together to say, let's take this on and try to really move the needle. So that's one. And then more internationally, one of the things that we have paid a lot of attention to is the sort of global energy poverty gap, where 700 million people don't have access to reliable, safe energy. They're literally living in the dark ages. And yet we've seen that there are these great product innovations that are affordable, bringing solar lighting to homes that live off the grid, helping people use solar energy to be more productive, using it, for example, to fuel cold chain solutions that reduce food waste and help farmers be more successful. So we've launched a program, a $250 million program that brings together capital from commercial banks and development financed institutions, foundations, individuals, corporations, like a group of over 20 partners who said, let's really hone in on the most difficult to serve markets in Africa and show how we can creatively pool capital of different kinds, some super flexible philanthropic capital, other more sort of commercial debt financing, different levels of risk for different investors, to say, we have the knowledge, and what we need to do is find those entrepreneurial solutions and incentivize them in completely new ways to operate in markets that the world has sort of left behind. So that's been something I'm incredibly proud of, to literally go into countries that have the highest rates of poverty and the lowest rates of electrification and say, we're going to really transform these countries in terms of energy access by betting on entrepreneurs who are committed to, solving this problem in Africa. So all of these things, it takes so much creativity, so many different kinds of partners coming together. But when it works, it does give you that feeling of hope. This is not just a dream. We've seen over 200 million people get access to energy through our investing work over the last 15 years. So we know we're on the right path, and it motivates us when the going gets tough.
Yeah, that's exciting. So let's talk about both those too, because I got some questions about the details. So the 250 million dedicated to energy access entrepreneurs, does that come in like, let's say you're the entrepreneur on the ground, does that come in as a blended capital stack where some of it's philanthropy, some of it's a bank debt? How does it all work just from a tactical standpoint?
Yeah, well, my apologies to my colleagues who actually run this program that I don't make a mistake when I describe it, but I'll try
Sure.
to kind of stay high level. Where it could start is you're an entrepreneur that says, I think there's potential to deliver energy in this economy in this way. And so you might get some support to pilot that idea, to say, okay, let's help you get a foothold in a country like Somalia or Malawi or Benin, where there's very little infrastructure, to start to figure out, who might be your distributors and what are the right products, what are the sources of financing, how might you work, for example, with local, national governments that can help provide incentives or support on the consumer side. So really, we raised over $50 million in philanthropy to help enable that sort of early piloting, experimentation, market creation work. And then when someone's like, okay, this is going to work, here's how it's going to happen. We've found some local distributors. We've figured out how to build their capacity. We're working with, there's a whole coalition that's designed to help bring more targeted subsidies to energy consumers so that we can promote off-grid energy access through the World Bank. And so when all the pieces come together, it's like, okay, we're going to try to scale this now. We need working capital, right? We're going to be bringing in this product and having inventory. And that's where a debt component would come in. And so the debt allows you to then scale up that business model as you've sort of built the skeleton of it. And the really cool part on the debt financing is we want to work with entrepreneurs that aren't just looking for that sort of easy market, but going and penetrating beyond urban areas into peri-urban and rural areas and reaching low-income consumers. And so we've incentivized that by pricing the debt based on the percentage of customers that are living at or below the poverty line. And that price of debt can go down to almost zero if they're super successful in reaching those vulnerable and rural populations. And the reason why isn't just as a pat on the back, but it's actually more expensive sometimes to reach a more remote, a more rural customer. And so we want to recognize that in how we structure the financing. So we've had to raise separate pools of grant funding to help create that sort of that then offsets the cost of capital for the entrepreneur. The complexity of this is a little bit hard to get into. I've seen like beautiful diagrams, but when it's actually working and you see all the pieces coming together, it's really exciting. And so we're actually going to be launching, closing towards the end of this year, and we've already started mobilizing capital on the philanthropy side.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I wanted to ask a question about the tactics because I've had an experience recently attempting to raise impact equity for some like very basic stuff, like affordable housing deals in urban Los Angeles. This is like predictable returns, cookie cutter. And what I've noticed in interfacing in just that type of deal in this market is that what I'm seeing is that there's not really a strong impulse to what I would consider impact investing. And it comes down to the intent. And so what I think is so special about what you guys are doing is that you've made the fundamental philosophical understanding that capital has to be priced differently and maybe have to be priced at zero in order to make something happen in the long term. Where the impact investors that I'm coming across, like if Wall Street wants me to earn a 20% IRR, they're at 18 or something. And so yeah, there's a delta, right? Like, but it's not enough to move the needle. And these are all well-intentioned people. This is not to be overly critical. They have their own challenges because they have investors who want these returns in the first place. But the truth is if we care about impact, we need capital to be incredibly flexible. And like the model that you just described that you have designed, it's super important because some businesses like require a leap of faith in terms of money. And if you're asking for an 18% return day one, they're never going to get started. and you miss this opportunity, and then you're back in the, just giving out checks every year to try to alleviate poverty instead of creating the ecosystem. So I think it's a philosophical or a mind shift change that we need to see. And I don't know, how many people get it? Like, are people around the world kind of understanding it, or is it hard to have these conversations?
I love that question. How many people get it? I wish I knew exactly how many. I wish I knew who they were, and how to find them. But as I'm sure you've seen, there's a growing movement around this, but it's also very nonlinear, right? There's progress forward and progress backwards. And we've seen that with like even ESG as a concept, where that language is no longer seen and embraced in the same way that it was. And so it can be very cyclical. But what I would say is that there's something around the way that social impact, however you define it, is undervalued, right? And people will say it's impossible to value, and yet we've seen a lot of great efforts to put a price on social impact. In some cases, we've seen impact bonds that say, there's a cost when someone goes to an emergency room, right? A cost on the system, or when someone goes back to prison after having been released. And so if you can actually look at some of those costs, you can say, well, who's bearing those costs? And might they be interested in supporting something that proactively works to reduce those costs, but also in a way that really respects human dignity, right? People are not just a burden on society, but the way that we've built our society, a lot of people aren't getting the same sorts of opportunities. And someone, often all of us, bear that cost. And so there's something about really getting more sophisticated, and climate change is a great example. Like, emissions are taking a toll, right? They're creating a cost to society in the form of, extreme weather and fires. And those costs are being paid out by insurance firms or by individuals who often are the least able to afford it. And so I think there's something about starting to creatively monetize the value of those impacts. And then that's why, to me, collaboration and partnership is so important, because you might have someone who's like, I want to invest, and this is the return that I'm expecting. And then next to them, someone who says, I want to invest, but I'd be willing to take less return because I'm excited about the social impact. So they're getting a return, but maybe they're accepting more risk. And maybe they'll even say, you know what, I'll offset the risk for this person next to me, because they're not allowed to take that kind of risk with this capital, right? And then they say, but you know what, there's still going to be some kind of a grant that's needed, whether it's to, reduce the cost of capital for the borrower or to do R&D. And someone comes in and says, you know what, I would support that piece of it because I see the value of this innovation. And that's what I personally put value on. And you throw in some climate credits and someone says, this project not only helps vulnerable people and will make some people money, but it's also going to sequester a ton of carbon. I need that. I'm trying to find some carbon credits. I'll pay for that. So you start to put these pieces together. And I find that rather than figuring out how to judge people because they don't totally get it and they're not willing to take on a risk that they should or subsidize their return, to find those people that actually can sit together because they have different interests that are complementary. That feels more, I guess, effective in the long run than trying to convince everyone to value the same things. And particularly when you talk about private or commercial capital, there's a whole market system that works in a certain way. And we do need to shift that system. But the best way to do it, I think, is to bring people into proximity. And so when we work with a commercial bank, yeah, there's certain rules that we need to play by and there's risks that have to be mitigated, but they're at the party now. And they're starting to see what's been unlocked. And the way they think about investing in the future might be different, right? When they start to see the benefits, the learning, the social impact, the pride that comes out of being a part of something like this. So it's more of like, bring everybody to the party rather than tell people what they're missing.
Yeah, it makes sense.
And it's a lot of work. It takes a long time. And there is risk involved. Like you said, there's a leap of faith. So what we found with our collaborations is that it is a group of human beings, and many of them are taking a leap of faith. They're doing a lot of work within their organizations to convince people to do that, but people can only leap so far. And that's just the reality of the system that we live in. So, I always find that there's this tension between, are you working inside the system and just getting really good at playing the game, or are you changing the system? I think it has to be both.
Yeah, that's well said. In thinking about this whole area and the challenges that I had and these conversations that you and I've had over the last 6 months, it seems like there's this like there feels like there's a change happening in the mindsets, and it's a broad-based change. Like people have been interested in impact and helping vulnerable populations and solving big issues. And the lexicon keeps changing, right? It's ESG, it's social impact. It's not social impact. It's just regular impact. It's this and that. And when I zoomed out in my thinking on it, what we're really talking about are like externalities that haven't been accounted for. And so like a good example like is climate change is like obvious, right? You cause decades of not paying the cost of these externalities, and now we're paying the bill, insurance companies and individuals and countries and whatnot. But there's other ones too, like social media is a good example, right? Like social media, if you look at them the way we measure them, these are the best businesses that have ever been created, 50% profit margins forever, and they keep growing. But are we measuring the cost? And what I can tell from talking to colleagues and friends and just paying attention to culture, people are actually really concerned about the cost. If you called the cost social impact, you would lose half the audience because maybe they don't like that. But the cost of like, hey, kids are depressed, people are feeling lonely and isolated, blah, blah, blah. Like you listed out all these things. And so I feel like we just haven't come up with the right words yet that would unite Americans or people around the world to reflect these externalities. What do you think of that?
No, I think you've captured it really well. I think that there are these hidden costs, and they're sort of parallel or twin is the hidden benefits, right? A business model that really promotes confidence and empowers communities and employs people that have been left out. And none of that is valued, right? It's just not something that we have ways of keeping tabs on. So I do think that, in my mind, the beautiful thing about being human is humans are sort of capable of anything. It's just the choices that we make. And I feel like that ability to correctly value the cost or the benefit of the way that we run businesses, participate in the economy, vote. I don't know. It's something that really does need to shift. And as you're saying, you think that this is really growing. I think it has been growing, and you see all kinds of signs of it, right? Whether it's the growth in impact investing, the growth of social businesses that do put purpose at the center. We've seen, in certain economies, like really massive transition towards use of renewable energy, more effective recycling, regenerative agriculture. Really exciting things are happening. At the same time, we're seeing other spaces, including in the US, where things are moving in the opposite direction. And so policies can change the incentives for people to choose to reduce their pollution through the cars that they buy or the ways that they manage their construction and design for housing. So to me, again, it's super nonlinear, and there's nothing that says that progress is inevitable. I think we're really at a crossroads at this moment. And what I find, and this is probably connected back to social media, is that when people make their decisions from a place of fear, right? And this is what we see so much in messaging, to really foment that sense of fear, you can very easily get people to make, I think, short-term decisions that are not really serving us well in the long run. And so when I think about hope and when I look for reasons for hope from the people that I work with, the people in our community, it's not just a feel good. It's a way of rewiring and reframing how we make decisions, right? Because if you come from that place of hope and you're like, we could actually get through this, we could make things better, we have that potential, there's examples all around us, you can start to behave differently because you see the path that you're on. If you come from a place of fear, people pull back, right? And we're seeing that too. We're seeing people who are paralyzed, right? They're afraid to do anything because of what it might mean. They're waiting. We're waiting it out, right? At a time when we need to see action. So again, not to get too philosophical, but I do think that dichotomy is really important. And it means that people have to be proactive, I think, in cultivating hope, right?
Yeah.
You have to look for it, because if you just go through Instagram, and I'll confess, I'm on Instagram probably every day for about an hour if I add up all the little chunks. And I can tell which are the messages that give me hope, that make me feel like, you know what, I can get up tomorrow, I can probably do something that matters, versus the ones that make me feel afraid. And I'm
Yeah.
like, I'm probably going to want to, hide under my pillow tomorrow and stand still because it just feels too scary out there. And so we have to cultivate that, I think, intentionally. And there's no shortage of evidence, right? I mean, again, I was so lucky to be able to travel this year, but meeting an entrepreneur in Colombia who's figuring out how to do carbon sequestration projects based on reforesting parts of the Amazon with native species is a very complicated endeavor. It's a multi-decade project that they've taken on, but they're just out there doing it. They're gathering seeds and planting seedlings and engaging with the community. And I'm like, if that's what she gets up and does every day, that really hard, long-term, slow, and maybe unsuccessful effort, right? If they don't get the project financing for those carbon projects, but they're going to try anyway. I'm like, I can get out of bed today and go do my part. And so I think people have to get out more.
Yeah.
What's going on in the community, but there's so much reason for hope.
I think so too. Like, by the way, I feel the same way about social media. It's 50-50, and it's incredibly powerful on your psychology. You can't underestimate. It doesn't matter how enlightened you think you are. Social media can get you for sure.
For
Um,
sure. Nobody's immune.
it's not. But there are there are tons of cool things happening, tons of opportunities. Last couple questions, I know you got to go. What do you think, or what are you seeing from corporations that gets you excited? Because they're in the mix on this too, right? You've got philanthropists, you got eccentric billionaires, and you got big corporations too. So what are you seeing on that front?
Yeah. So it's sort of hard to name names because I think more and more corporations who are doing really good, really creative work find that it doesn't pay to kind of put it out there in a big way. Um, and it's a shame because it does, I think, inspire others. A term I learned last year was it was like the opposite of greenwashing. It was like basically just the silence, right, of people
Yeah,
not wanting to talk, green hushing,
green hushing. Okay.
and not wanting to talk about it out loud because you just sort of put a target on your back. But there are specific examples that I'm seeing. There's a company that's launched I mean, I don't know again how public it is, so I'm not going to name them, but a $250 million impact fund that is designed to help find and support businesses that they think will ultimately have real meaningful impact for the sustainability of their supply chain. We've seen companies. Obviously, I focus a lot on companies that want to work with social enterprises. We are working with EY, the consultancy, and ServiceNow, the tech company, to support entrepreneurs working in climate tech. And again, there's just ways that companies are saying, between our resources, our knowledge and know-how, right, the technologies we have access to, EY has been directly supporting social enterprises for over a decade using their sort of advisory capabilities. And what's so fun to watch when companies do lean in to sustainability, social impact, bringing their employees to the table. I think they find, they have to measure the ROI. So a lot of them, especially in this environment, are thinking about how does this come back to our core business? How does this align to our supply chain, making our business more resilient? And that's been around and is maybe just a bit more acute now. But the intangible benefits that these companies end up experiencing, it's also really fun to see those unfold, right? It's the thing that the CEO is excited about. It's the thing that employees talk about when they're asked, why do you work here? And so I always encourage companies to figure out, again, how do they sort of line up all the benefits of doing this sort of work so it's not isolated to just one pocket of the business, right? It's not just a PR effort and it's not just solving a problem in your supply chain, but you can build something that really connects the dots on a lot of different levels, that it enhances the brand, employee engagement, does make your supply chain more resilient, does give you insight into new markets. And those are hard partnerships to build, but I do feel like that's the future of corporate engagement in social impact. And when they do that, what they'll end up doing is bringing a lot more to the table than just a check, right? So they'll say, okay, we could invest with this capital, we could do a little grant over here. Let's get our PR resources on board and let's have these talented people in our company help out too, right? And they could bring so much to the table. So we do see that. It's, I think, really exciting. Again, I think in the US, companies have to figure out not only what they can do, but how do they talk about it? How do they frame it in a way that isn't going to I guess, cause a backlash in this environment or directly from our federal government. So we've heard that word reframing a lot, but a lot of the work that companies have been doing, they've realized that it's really good for business, right? Like DEI is a great example. Companies recognized early on that there's a lot of benefits to a business that has diverse employees, engages diverse customers, has diverse perspectives and leadership, and not just racial diversity, but really diversity across the board. So they figured it out. They're not going to reverse it. They're probably going to talk about it differently. So I think it takes a little bit of nuance or sleuthing to understand what's going on these days. But yeah, if people are looking for simple stories, whatever the topic, I think things are much murkier now. And so one of our favorite words at Acumen is nuance. Like that's where the real magic happens, when you can sort of go beyond the obvious and see how do you put some of these pieces together in a more nuanced way.
Yeah, I love that. And these corporations too, like they sit, whether they know it or not, they sit at an incredible position in our society because they have so much influence. Like these multinational corporations that employ so many thousands and thousands of people, and they have so much cash. Like a lot of these companies have more cash in their bank account than the countries that Acumen sponsors projects in. I mean, these are unbelievable global actors. And I feel like if and when they wake up to that responsibility that comes along with that, they really can become a force for good in the community. And
Yeah, and I think it really goes beyond responsibility. I mean, I think even just from a fiduciary perspective, we are seeing the vulnerability of global supply chains. We are seeing that instability, right? So you're looking for market growth, you have to look at emerging economies, right? And then you need license to operate. How do you show up in a country and build the kinds of relationships you need? And these companies figured this out a long time ago, right? So to me, it's just a question of, how do they get smarter and smarter at building resilient business models? I don't think it's going to go away. And, what I find interesting is more companies are starting to think about how they could use investment as a tool to advance issues that have typically been supported with grants or philanthropy. And of course, that unlocks a lot more capital. So we've done some work around corporate impact investing. And that to me is some of the most exciting impact investing that's happening, because those are very strategic investments, right? Companies are not just investing kind of for fun. They're really thinking about, like, what would it look like to make the cocoa supply chain in, West Africa more resilient and sustainable, and what they can bring if they have investment capital and they have, again, a supply chain to do offtake and tons of expertise, could be totally transformative. But again, no one's going to do it because of a sense of responsibility, right? I think it's this idea of business is a force, right? And why not make it a force that lasts for 100 years or 200 years? I think I saw this when I was in Kenya. I saw in the news that I think it was Dole. Anyway, some very old company, like 120-year-old company, had declared bankruptcy because there was a point where people were sort of hoarding canned food. So they dramatically increased their capacity. That hoarding behavior dropped off after COVID, and they essentially were, massively in debt. And, to think of a 120-year-old company declaring bankruptcy, it just reminds you that, nothing is guaranteed. And so to me, this is smart business. And a really smart business knows that it is, a business made up of human beings. More and more human beings, I think, just want to feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves.
yeah, I think that's true. I feel like that is the natural human impulse. And the more you can tap into it, obviously you can go down the dark side. You can appeal to other impulses that are also natural to humans. But if you appeal to this one, you can really get a lot of tailwind and build something spectacular. And these companies, they need that to survive. It's a very competitive world.
Yeah. And it really matters. I mean, I feel like this is where consumer behavior really comes into play. And we are seeing it. We're seeing companies that are taking a big hit when their choices do not reflect the values of their customers. And I think it's a healthy reminder, right, that this stuff does matter because people are operating within a community.
Yep. I think it's a huge deal. And I feel like it's going to become a bigger deal. Like the consumer, like especially in a developed economy, like maybe it's different in Somalia, but in America, where the economy is a 70% consumer economy, that consumers have
Yeah.
so much power, and they could kill a company overnight by just deciding not to participate in whatever they're selling. And I think consumers have woken up to that power and are selectively using it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there could be a lot more of that. I feel like the influence is possible, but not always fully leveraged.
Yeah.
And it just comes back to that sense of hope and fear. I think when people see themselves as agents of change, they see that potential. I think it does seep into the choices that they make. But when they are, fearful, they get more isolated and they sort of get convinced that what they do doesn't matter. And so, I think it's got to be an intentional choice that people make every day, even when there's a lot of reasons to despair, but to choose hope.
Yeah, that's right. Well, let's end on a hopeful note. For people who are excited by your work and Acumen and want to get involved, people, corporate leaders, corporations, businesses, what should they do?
Well, we've tried really hard to put a ton of resources on our website. We have a whole knowledge center and we share information about, monetizing social impact and making supply chains more sustainable. We have tons of great stories just for people who may want to feel like, why does she feel so hopeful after going to Kenya? Those stories are on our website. And I encourage people, again, to just be intentional about looking for examples and getting feeds, right, that lift them up. Our Instagram feed, our LinkedIn feed, like we're really putting out those stories about what's working and who's making a difference. So I encourage people to tap into that. And I just think as individuals, there's so much that people can do. So if you support a nonprofit, that's great. We are one you can support. But just thinking about, how do you invest your capital, right? Your investment capital may have way more impact than your donations. What products do you buy? And what are the conversations that we're having, right? Paying attention to when you focus on despair, whether or when you focus on what's possible. And in my mind, there's sort of no excuse to say I haven't seen anything good because it's out there and you just have to look for it. So I hope people use Acumen for that source of hope and inspiration. We regularly show up in cities across the country to bring communities together who want to connect, get engaged, get their companies involved, learn more. So obviously anyone could reach out to me if they want to learn more.
That's amazing. Well, Yasmina, really fun conversation. So glad to have you back on the podcast, and we're going to keep this conversation going. We'll do another one, I'm sure. And thank you
I
for
would
being.
love that. Thank you so much. It's always so amazing to talk to you, Nick.
Thank you. Appreciate that.